In 1965, when Harlem was a cauldron of simmering tension, with the streets alive with the echoes of civil rights struggles and cultural revolutions, Tony, the boss Valente, made a decision that would seal his fate. He thought his position at the top of New York's Mafia food chain, his ties to powerful men, and his iron grip on the streets of Manhattan made him untouchable. He believed that his wealth, power, and reputation would ensure no one could challenge him. But what Valente didn't know was that he was about to face the one man whose name commanded respect from the Bronx to Brooklyn, from the wealthiest uptown penthouses to the deepest streets of Harlem. A man who didn't play by anyone's rules but his own, Bumpy Johnson. Valente thought he could disrespect Harlem and in doing so threaten the very balance of power in the city. But Bumpy Johnson wasn't just any man. He was a legend, and legends don't back down. This is the story of how Bumpy Johnson walked into a Mafia restaurant alone, and how by the end of it, 100 mobsters stopped eating and never returned. Tony, the boss. Valente had been at the top for years. His dark eyes, sharp as daggers, and his well-tailored suits were the uniform of his power. He wasn't just a mobster, he was the mobster, a man who had carved his name into the streets of New York with ruthless precision. A large, burly man who believed his size and connections made him invincible, Valente had built his empire through fear, manipulation, and a willingness to do whatever was necessary. The hierarchy of power was simple. He was at the top, and everyone else existed to serve him. But there was something Valente didn't understand. His power was built on sand. It was fragile, ready to crumble at the slightest push from the right person. And that person was Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy, unlike Valente, didn't flaunt his power. He didn't need to. His was a quiet authority, built not by fear but by respect. While the Mafia had their flashy show of wealth, Bumpy's empire was rooted in the streets. Harlem was his, not because he had the most money, but because he had the most respect. Bumpy was the kind of man whose presence was felt before he even entered a room. He didn't make threats, he made things happen. He was the embodiment of the street code, a man who had risen through struggle, pain, and sacrifice. When Valente's Mafia restaurant, a spot favored by mobsters from all over the city, began pushing into Bumpy's territory, taking over bars, clubs, and businesses that Harlem had claimed as its own, it was clear that there would be consequences. Valente, in his arrogance, believed that Harlem was nothing but a cash cow, a place to siphon money from. But he was about to learn the hard way that there were lines you simply didn't cross. The stakes weren't just about business, they were about respect. Bumpy's people weren't just employees, they were family. And no one, especially not an outsider like Valente, was going to come into Harlem and treat it as a commodity to be exploited. Valente's Mafia restaurant, Valente's Italian steakhouse, had become the new go-to spot for the city's most powerful men, mostly Mafia dons from rival families, shady businessmen, and corrupt politicians. It was a place where deals were made under the guise of fine dining, and the backroom saw the exchange of bribes, blackmail, and sometimes more sinister things. The problem for Bumpy was simple. This was his turf, his people, and Valente had started taking more than his fair share. From muscle men to nightclub owners, Bumpy's network was being undercut. His neighborhood was being turned into a battleground between rival factions, and the tipping point came when Valente's men, working under the Mafia boss's orders, started bullying the local businesses and extorting local vendors that Bumpy had long protected. This wasn't just a violation of business, it was an insult to everything Bumpy had worked for. His legacy in Harlem wasn't built on corruption or intimidation. It was built on loyalty, protection, and the idea that Harlem had its own system of justice. What Valente had done was try to impose his own system on Harlem, one that would disrupt the delicate balance of respect Bumpy had cultivated for decades. At first, Bumpy tried to let it slide, Harlem had its problems, and he knew that no empire was free from conflict. But Valente wasn't content to just run his business. He wanted to take over Harlem. When Bumpy's warning to Valente's men was ignored, Bumpy knew that it was time to act. The moral line had been crossed. Valente was threatening the very thing Bumpy held most dear: Harlem's autonomy, its dignity, and its respect. Bumpy was never one to start a fight, but he was also never one to back down from one. Valente had made his move, and now it was Bumpy's turn to make his. The time for waiting was over. It was time for justice, and Bumpy wasn't going to let anyone, not even the most powerful mafia boss in New York, think they could challenge him or his people. Valente's arrogance had sealed his fate. He had stepped into Bumpy's world, and now Bumpy was going to make sure everyone knew that Harlem wasn't a place to be trifled with. It started when Tony, the boss Valente, made the fatal mistake of sending his men to muscle in on a local club, one that was under the protection of Bumpy Johnson's network. The club, Harlem's finest, was more than just a hotspot for good music and good times. It was a community hub, a symbol of the neighborhood's pride. It had been owned by a longtime friend of Bumpy's, Reggie Biggie Williams, who had grown up with Bumpy and carried the same code of loyalty and respect that defined Harlem streets. Biggie wasn't a gangster, but he was respected, a man who worked hard for what he had and never turned his back on his people. When Valente's men came in and demanded a cut of the profits, it wasn't just an extortion attempt. It was an assault on everything Biggie stood for. Biggie refused. He didn't care who Valente was or what power he held in the city. Harlem wasn't a place where you gave in to bullies, no matter how powerful they were. That's when things escalated. The next night, a group of Valente's men showed up again, this time with more muscle and a far more aggressive attitude. They barged into the club, knocking over tables, shoving staff around, and demanding payment. Biggie stood his ground, but when one of the mobsters tried to shove him, that's when the situation turned violent. The tables turned over, and fists started flying. By the time it was over, Biggie had been thrown to the ground and beaten hard. The attackers had made sure to leave their mark, but the message was clear. Biggie wasn't just a man who ran a club. He was connected to something much bigger, and in the Mafia's eyes that made him a target. When word reached Bumpy Johnson, it didn't take long for the gravity of the situation to hit him. This wasn't just a small altercation, it was a direct challenge to his authority. Bumpy's reaction was immediate. No one, not even the biggest mafia bosses in the city, could step into Harlem and treat his people like this. He wasn't just defending Biggie, he was defending the entire spirit of Harlem, the very foundation on which his empire stood. Without a word, Bumpy gathered his most trusted men, Willie, Charlie, and Tommy, and began formulating a plan. He wasn't going to storm the restaurant with guns blazing or start a gang war. He was going to handle this in a way that no one would ever forget. The message needed to be clear. Respect was non-negotiable. Bumpy knew what the stakes were. He wasn't just defending his own reputation or his business empire. He was defending the code that had made him a legend in Harlem. His actions would not just affect Valente. They would affect the entire city. If Bumpy was going to make a move, it would have to be one that was heard from the back alleys of Harlem to the mafia-dominated skyscrapers of downtown Manhattan. Bumpy had always kept his ear to the streets, and when news reached him that Tony Valente's Mafia restaurant, Valente's Italian steakhouse, had become a regular haunt for his rivals, he knew the time to act was now. But he didn't need to rush. He understood that patience was just as powerful as a well-placed punch. He didn't just want to retaliate, he wanted to teach a lesson. He got the full picture when Willie, his sharp-eyed messenger, came into the room, a look of resolve on his face. "They've been talking about Valente's place all day, boss. His men are out there flexing their muscle like they own the whole damn city." Bumpy leaned back in his chair, looking out the window of his office, the hum of Harlem's streets, a constant reminder of the people he fought for. You've got to make sure you're always paying attention, Willie, Bumpy said, his voice calm and deliberate. A man's ego is his biggest enemy. Valente thinks he can walk in here and treat us like we're nobody, but we're going to show him just how wrong he is. Bumpy's eyes narrowed, but his demeanor remained unshaken. He had already thought through his plan. There would be no immediate violence, no open war. Valente wasn't just some rookie in the streets, he was a seasoned player who understood power and fear. Bumpy knew that the best way to bring Valente down was through a quiet show of strength, not brute force. We're going to send a message, but we'll do it in a way that leaves them wondering what just happened. Willie nodded, understanding what Bumpy meant. There was no need for bloodshed. Bumpy's reputation and his calculated actions would speak louder than any gunfight ever could. But Bumpy wasn't just protecting his turf, he was protecting a legacy of respect. No one was above the law of Harlem, not even the Mafia. For the next few days, Bumpy kept his distance from the unfolding situation. He allowed Valente and his men to continue operating under the false belief that they were untouchable. Valente continued his business, feeling more secure with each passing day. Little did he know that every step he took was being watched. Bumpy's plan had already begun to unfold. Willie, Charlie, and Tommy were on the ground, keeping track of Valente's movements. They knew exactly when Valente would be at the restaurant, when his men would be off their guard, and when it would be time to strike. Meanwhile, Bumpy kept up appearances. He continued to move through Harlem streets, meeting with his people, checking in on his business, and making sure that no one knew what was coming. To Valente, Harlem was still a place he could control, and he grew more arrogant with each passing day. Bumpy's strategic patience made all the difference. He understood that the more relaxed his enemy became, the more vulnerable they were. By now, Valente had fallen into a false sense of security. He thought he could continue with his operations without fear of consequence, and Bumpy knew that when the moment came, it would be devastating. As Bumpy prepared, the anticipation grew. Harlem was on edge, but not in a way that would tip off Valente. Every man and woman in the streets of Harlem understood that when Bumpy made a move, it was not a decision made in anger. It was made in precision, and the entire city was about to feel the weight of that precision. The night had come. Bumpy Johnson, surrounded by only his most trusted men, walked into Valente's Italian steakhouse alone. It wasn't a confrontation that involved guns or violence. It wasn't even a public scene. It was a quiet, controlled moment that would shake the foundation of everything Valente thought he had built. Bumpy walked in with a calm assurance that made every mobster in the room stop what they were doing. It wasn't a threat, but it was an unmistakable presence. The restaurant fell silent. Valente was sitting at the bar, a smug grin on his face as he sipped his whiskey. He had no idea what was coming. Bumpy walked toward him, his eyes scanning the room, and when Valente finally saw him, he rose from his seat, a look of surprise flashing across his face. "Do you know who I am?" Valente sneered, trying to regain control of the situation. Bumpy didn't respond right away. He simply stood there, the weight of his legacy radiating in every movement. "Yeah, I know who you are," Bumpy finally replied, his voice steady. "But you don't know who you're dealing with." The room was still, and for a moment, everyone waited. Bumpy's presence had already delivered a message, one that Valente wouldn't soon forget. It was the kind of moment that would be spoken about in whispers for decades. As Bumpy Johnson stood in Valente's Italian steakhouse, the room became thick with tension. The clinking of silverware and the murmur of conversation had fallen to a dead silence. It wasn't just the fact that Bumpy had entered the restaurant alone, it was the way he carried himself. The Mafia mobsters, once so confident in their territory, now found themselves caught off guard. Tony Valente, who had always been the center of attention in his domain, stood frozen. For a brief second, he tried to mask his unease with arrogance. "Do you know who I am?" he sneered, trying to make his voice steady as he looked down at Bumpy from his seat at the bar. Bumpy didn't rush to respond. He simply took a few measured steps forward, his eyes cold but sharp, cutting through the tension in the air. The other men in the restaurant, their expressions a mix of confusion and uncertainty, glanced nervously at one another. Valente's arrogance, which had once been his shield, was beginning to falter. Bumpy stopped just a few feet away from Valente, towering over him. For a moment neither man spoke. The air felt heavy with history, the history of a street legend who had seen it all, and the Mafia boss who thought he could waltz into Harlem and take what didn't belong to him. "Yeah, I know who you are," Bumpy replied, his voice calm, almost soothing. "But you don't know who I am." Valente's jaw clenched, and the room seemed to hold its breath. He could feel the eyes of his men on him, but something had shifted in the air. "I run things here, Bumpy," he growled, trying to regain some of the control he felt slipping away. "You don't get to walk in here," and Bumpy cut him off with a single, quiet statement. "You're not the boss here, not in Harlem." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and for a moment it felt as if time had stopped. The Mafia men around the room watched, transfixed, as Bumpy's presence slowly began to overpower the arrogant energy that had once filled the restaurant. This wasn't a Mafia meeting, a power struggle, or a negotiation. This was something deeper, something personal. As Bumpy's words sank in, Valente's face changed. The bravado that had once defined him began to crack, replaced by a flicker of doubt. He stood there, speechless for a brief second, the reality of what was happening finally setting in. In this moment, Bumpy wasn't just a gangster, he was the embodiment of Harlem street justice, the man who didn't need to be feared to command power. The silence was broken by the sound of chairs scraping against the floor, as if the room collectively realized that Bumpy Johnson had not just entered their territory, but had claimed it, with no violence, no threats, just pure, unwavering authority. Valente tried to force a smile, but it was clear he was losing control. "You think you can walk in here, into my restaurant, and threaten me?" he spat, his arrogance returning in a last-ditch attempt to salvage his dignity. Bumpy didn't flinch. He remained still, his gaze locked onto Valente's. "No, I'm not threatening you, Tony. I'm teaching you a lesson. You don't come into Harlem and disrespect us. You don't play by your own rules in my city." Bumpy's voice, while calm, carried the weight of 100 unspoken truths. Harlem had its own code, its own sense of respect, and anyone who violated that code was bound to face the consequences. In that instant, Bumpy Johnson didn't need to raise a hand or issue any physical threat. His presence alone delivered the kind of justice that no amount of violence could ever achieve. The Mafia men in the room, once so sure of their dominance, began to shrink back, realizing they were witnessing something much larger than they had anticipated. Bumpy's calculated action, standing there, unwavering, while Valente's bravado evaporated, had already won the battle. The message had been sent. The Mafia men who had once seen Harlem as their playground now understood that their presence was no longer welcome. As Bumpy turned to leave, he paused by the door and looked back at Valente, his final words carrying the full weight of what had just transpired. "You don't own Harlem, Tony. We've always had a different kind of respect here. You're free to leave with your men, but remember this. Respect can't be bought or stolen, and it sure as hell can't be taken from Harlem." Valente, stunned and humiliated, stood frozen as Bumpy walked out of the restaurant, leaving behind a room full of mobsters who would never forget the lesson they had just learned. As Bumpy's footsteps faded away, the silence in the room lingered. The Mafia men, their heads bowed in silent acknowledgement, slowly began to leave, each of them knowing that they would never be able to enter Harlem again in the same way. Valente's empire in Harlem, which had once seemed so untouchable, was crumbling before him. The fallout from Bumpy Johnson's visit to Valente's Italian steakhouse was immediate and undeniable. Over the next few weeks, whispers of what had transpired spread throughout the city. Harlem's reputation once again became a symbol of respect and justice. Bumpy's action had changed the power dynamic in a way that no one had expected, especially Valente. For Tony Valente, the consequences were swift and unforgiving. His once stronghold in Harlem collapsed. His restaurant, a place once filled with the most dangerous and powerful men in the city, became a ghost town. No one in the Mafia dared to show their face there again. The word had spread that Bumpy Johnson had shown the true meaning of power, not through fear, but through respect. Valente's business was all but destroyed, and he was forced to retreat, leaving Harlem behind. His connections in New York's criminal world faltered, as Bumpy's presence had not only humbled him, but had also reminded the Mafia of who truly held the power in the streets. For Harlem, however, the victory was more than just about protecting territory. It was a reaffirmation of the code that had kept the community strong. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a gangster, he was a guardian of Harlem's spirit, its dignity, and its unbreakable sense of respect. And so the legend of Bumpy Johnson grew not just as a man of power, but as a symbol of justice in a world that often confused fear with control. Those who crossed him, like Valente, learned that respect could never be taken for granted, and those who understood it would always hold the keys to true power. Bumpy Johnson's visit to Valente's restaurant changed the course of Harlem's history. It was a moment that would be remembered by all who saw it, not for the violence or the tension, but for the pure display of respect and authority that Bumpy commanded. It wasn't about being feared, it was about being untouchable, and Bumpy showed just how that was done. As you reflect on this story, ask yourself, what would you have done if you were Bumpy? Would you have walked in alone and taught the same lesson, or would you have used a different approach to handle the disrespect? If this story hit you, smash that subscribe button. We're telling the Bumpy Johnson stories that history forgot, the moments that made him a legend, the code that made him untouchable. Drop a like if you think Bumpy was the smartest man in Harlem, and in the comments, what would you have done if you were Tony Valente? More legendary stories coming next. Don't miss it.